So can you tell us about what happened yesterday in the Fed's meeting? I mean, how did the market not pull back 75 basis points? And did I hear this right, that the Feds are now going to monitor how they're selling off bonds and securities to stabilize the market?
Well, first of all, everybody knew the Fed was going to move 75 basis points. So it wasn't a surprise. It was already factored in. In fact, for a while, there were people that were thinking they were going to do 100 basis points, and they backtracked on that a while back. But I think what the markets seized on was the fact that the Fed claims that now they're at neutral and that going forward, they're more data dependent. And so they're not on autopilot. They're expecting to raise rates again in September, but they're not really sure by how much. So it depends on the data. And of course, if the data comes out weak as far as the economy is, and maybe we get a temporary reprieve on consumer prices, we may not get any rate hike at all. So I think that's what the market seized on, that we're really closer to the end now of this tightening cycle, which means we're closer to the beginning of the next easing cycle. And that's what it's all about for the markets. It's when are we going to get another fix of that monetary heroin? And I think it's coming, and it may even come before the end of this year. They may not have to wait until 2023 to get another round of QE and some rate cuts. The Fed might be supplying that before the end of this year.
I don't understand how the market can handle it, but I mean, I really wanted to get you on the show to talk about blockchain, and we kind of know your stance on Bitcoin. I feel like you never get a fair opportunity to explain yourself. Everybody's always attacking you about being negative on Bitcoin, and I wanted to give you a fair opportunity to talk about why Bitcoin may or may not survive, and then talk about what would you be looking for in a blockchain, because I've heard you kind of change your stance a little bit. You do believe that blockchain has a future, just not Bitcoin, correct?
Well, I don't think any of these, intrinsically worthless fiat tokens will ultimately have any value. I think that early on, there was a lot of excitement there and a lot of gambling. People that got in early and placed bets were able to cash out because people made even bigger bets who got in later. But I think all of these tokens, and that would include Bitcoin, are really no more than modern tulips. They're Ponzi's, they're pyramids, they're chain letters. I mean, interestingly enough, a chain letter is illegal. But if you put it on the blockchain, suddenly it's okay. But it really is the same concept. It's where you have one group of people making money by attracting another group of people to give it to them. And that's really what Bitcoin is. I buy Bitcoin and I need somebody else to buy it from me at a higher price. And that's the only way that I make money. But the only reason somebody would pay me a higher price for my Bitcoin is because they think there's somebody else that's going to pay them an even higher price for theirs. But, like all chain letters or pyramids, eventually you run out of suckers and you got a bag holder. You have the people who are left holding the bag, who are the greater fools, and there's nobody to sell to. And then the market implodes. And I think that we've already passed that point. I think the air is coming out of the Bitcoin bubble, the current rally notwithstanding. I think that the high is in, most likely for Bitcoin, and we're headed a lot lower. And, a lot of dreams are going to be shattered. People who thought Bitcoin was going to be some new global money, it was going to replace the dollar or the euro or the yen, and that it was going to replace gold. It's not going to replace anything. It was just the latest speculative mania that is, over. And a lot of people are going to learn this lesson the hard way and lose a lot of money.
I can see where you're coming from. So this is the exact environment that Bitcoin is supposed to thrive in, right? Inflation running rampant, the whole 9 yards. Like, this should be the environment where Bitcoin is putting in new all-time highs. People should be running to it as a hedge against inflation, but they're not. So you're saying that this previous top of 70,000 is the top? You don't think if the Fed...
most likely. Obviously, nothing is a sure thing. Is it possible that Bitcoin can make a new high? Sure, anything is possible. But if you look at what it took to get Bitcoin to 70,000 before, I just don't see a confluence of events like that happening again. I don't see the money going into the space that came in 2021 to drive it up there. It was a massive amount of advertising all over major networks. You had so much money that was spent promoting Bitcoin. You had all the celebrities, the athletes, entertainers who were promoting crypto on television to their Instagram followers. You had all the Super Bowl ads. You had the NFT craze. You had El Salvador. You had, Elon Musk getting involved. You had the Skybridge funds being created. So you had all this stuff. That's gone. Meanwhile, all that hype, all that advertising, and Bitcoin went down in 2021. The average person who bought it is way underwater on those purchases. So I think that was the end of it. And I've mentioned, just from my own experience, I've seen all the big money cashing out. I've seen all the people paying crazy prices for real estate here in Puerto Rico. Almost all of them are from the crypto space. So they're cashing out of crypto and they're buying real estate and other assets. And I think now, it's a race to get out. The smart money is selling, and you still have some dumb money that is buying. But fools are going to eventually run out of money, and the market's just going to implode.
The sad thing that nobody talks about in this industry is, as far as building a blockchain that could meet the demands of global real-world adoption, there is only one in the history of crypto. I'm talking about not Polkadot, not Ethereum. These blockchains couldn't even support tweets per second. If you wanted to put every tweet on a blockchain, it would blow every blockchain out of the water. It couldn't support it. But nobody talks about that. So let me ask you this. Say there was a blockchain that insurance companies wanted to use, healthcare industry wanted to use, because it helped audit their books, or they could move a lot of, I don't know how to say it to you. It would eliminate staff. It would make things transparent. It would allow you to put a lot of data on chain because it could actually scale. It could actually make the world a better place.
It's very possible that businesses will find viable uses for blockchain. But that's got nothing to do with Bitcoin.
No.
Bitcoin needs a blockchain, but a blockchain doesn't need Bitcoin. And just because you own Bitcoin, you don't have any ownership stake in any kind of revenue generating blockchain. You just own a token. You own a digital token. And what is the value of that token? Well, it's no value. The only value is that you could sell it to somebody, but that assumes that person wants to buy it from you. But who's to say that anyone's going to want to buy your Bitcoin in the future? I don't want to buy your Bitcoin now. If I bought it, it would just be to turn around and sell it. But eventually nobody's going to want it. But look, if you put something of real value on a blockchain, where the blockchain can increase that value by making something more easy to verify and to transact in, let's say gold, for example. A lot of the criticisms that the Bitcoin people have against gold is that, well, I got a bar of gold. How do I send it to Australia? How do I use it to buy a cup of coffee? Well, apart from the fact that nobody uses Bitcoin to buy a cup of coffee either, if I took my bar of gold and put it with a company that could tokenize it on a blockchain, and now I can have these digital tokens that are backed by the actual gold that's in deposit, now I can transact in those tokens. I can use those tokens to buy a cup of coffee. The coffee merchant can sell me coffee and get paid in gold via a blockchain. If I want to send some gold to a buddy in Australia, I could just use the blockchain to transfer my ownership to him. So now he's got the token that, is backed by the gold that's sitting on deposit with the company that has this blockchain. So you can put gold on a blockchain and that'll work fine. And that'll basically satisfy most of the criticism that people in Bitcoin community have of gold, where they think Bitcoin is somehow superior. The only difference is that you do have a third-party custodian that you have to trust. But, we trust third-party custodians all the time. You talked about insurance. All insurance policies means you have to trust a third party. You have to trust the company that is promising to pay the claims if you put one in. Capitalism is all about trusting third parties, and third parties have something very valuable. It's called a reputation, and reputation, goodwill, is a valuable commodity in a free market, and companies will do everything they can to preserve the value. So, you don't want to screw your customers over because you lose that goodwill, you lose that reputation. So I would rather put my faith in a reputable third party who is defending the goodwill of its reputation than to just trust a bunch of miners so I don't know, and just trust that a bunch of fools are going to want to buy my Bitcoin in the future, even though it has no value.
Yes, I agree with you 100%, Peter. What are your thoughts about how the SEC and the CTFC have now brought charges against Coinbase for listing unregistered securities? What would be the fallout of, these blockchains, these quote unquote decentralized blockchains getting labeled as securities? As an influencer,
well,
as a public
I think a lot
figure,
of these tokens would fail the Howey test in that
the
SEC would determine that they are securities, because I think a lot of people are investing in these things on the expectation of making money. And I think a lot of these tokens are being created by a group of people who are working in order to create value for these tokens and to make money for the people who invest in them. So I think the SEC is going to look at the vast majority of these tokens as securities, and they're going to say they need to be registered. And of course, that adds a whole lot of expense and makes a lot of these things unviable from the start. And of course, if the SEC can come out and say, hey, you're trading securities without a license, or you're trading unlicensed securities, they can come in and fine people. Maybe there's even criminality, I'm not sure. But I've never been a big fan of the SEC or, FINRA, even though I'm regulated by both by working in the security industry. I don't like what they're doing. But I do think that there is certainly a big space there for them to get into with respect to these currencies. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if one day they said Bitcoin was a security. Right now they claim it's a commodity, but to me, Bitcoin isn't a commodity. You don't do anything with it. It doesn't have any use like any other commodity. And obviously people buy Bitcoin expecting to make a profit. You can even argue that the miners are working collectively and they're being paid by the Bitcoin community. There may be a way that they can even classify Bitcoin. I think it's easier to classify other tokens. It'd probably be easier for them to say Ethereum is a security, but a lot of it is subjective. Remember, it's up to the government. The government just says, hey, this is our position. And, they have all kinds of crazy powers. So they want to say something's a security. It's going to be a security.
Now, as a public figure, do you have to follow different laws on how you talk about securities? Is this something like, the bigger influencers in the crypto space that say XRP is going to be $500 tomorrow, or 200X or 300X?
Yeah.
That's illegal, right? As a security?
Well, no, I'm a registered investment advisor. I'm a registered stockbroker. So there are rules that govern, what I could say. But if you're just talking about a cryptocurrency and you're not in the securities industry and you want to make some pie in the sky forecast, I think this token is going to the moon, you're allowed to say that. Now, but what you might not be allowed to do is pump and dump. That still may be a fraud. It may be a crime, even though you're not dealing with a security. If I have this token that I own or I create, or I buy some of it, and then I go out to my followers on Instagram or TikTok or wherever, or media, and I'm like, this is the greatest new token ever. This thing is going to get you rich. Just go out and buy it, and you're just going to make a fortune. It's going to the moon, right? And people start buying it, and then I sell out my tokens into all this demand I've created. I'm quietly selling the tokens I have to the people I just convinced to buy, and I'm cashing out as they're buying, and then I make a bunch of money, and then the tokens collapse and all the people who bought lost money. That can still be looked at as criminal activity, and we'll see what happens, because I think, by the very nature of this, that's what's happened. I think a lot of these celebrities, got tokens and then touted them and then cashed out as their fans were buying in.
Yep, I agree 100%. So where do you see the market going, and with what the feds are doing? You think we could actually be at bottom, or is at some point will the markets collapse? Can the feds not manage this? How long can they keep up this charade?
Now you're talking about the stock markets?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think the tech market is still going down. I think we could have a short-term rally. I don't know, but I think a lot of these very inflated bubbled stocks, companies with no earnings and high valuations, I think they're crashing, just like, the cryptos. But I think there'll be a number of real companies that the prices will make new highs. I mean, companies that have real businesses, real earnings, real dividends, real assets. But a lot of that is going to be just inflation. It's not really that the stock prices are going up. It's that the value of the money is going down. So you need more dollars to buy a share of stock. I think that's going to happen. And you're going to need more dollars, more euros, more yen to buy everything. I mean, all these countries have created too much money, and prices are going to have to rise. That's why I tell people to own real things, real assets. Don't have your money in paper. Now, I don't consider these crypto tokens really to be a viable hedge. So, but I think real assets are, and that would include stocks. Some real estate would be included in that. Precious metals, obviously, I think gold and silver are going to be good inflation hedges. They may not have been great hedges the last year, but over the last 20 years, the price of gold has gone from under 300. Now it's about 1750. It's been above 2000, but it's certainly in an uptrend. The uptrend has stalled out a little bit, but that's, normal. But I think the next big move for gold is going to be significantly higher.
And do you think that inflation is done? Do you think we've seen a peak on inflation?
It's just getting started. I mean, we've had inflation for a long time, but we're going to have it for an even longer period of time. Look, inflation is the way politicians pay for government. I mean, they're not honest enough to tax us to the degree that they spend. So they spend a lot of money, they don't collect enough in taxes, and they print the difference. I mean, the way it works in America is they borrow the money from the Fed. They issue bonds, the Fed buys the bonds and prints money. But that new money gets spent into circulation, and that's the inflation. They've called it quantitative easing for a number of years now, but quantitative easing is just a euphemism for inflation. That's what QE is. It's inflation. So instead of saying QE1, QE2, QE3, it's inflation 1, inflation 2, inflation 3. The Federal Reserve is deliberately creating inflation as a policy goal. And we're all dealing with the consequences when we have to buy stuff because everything is more expensive because of inflation.
So if they're not selling off bonds and securities anymore and they're going to stop raising interest rates, then it's inevitable that inflation continues to rise. And if 60% of Americans who make under $200,000 a year are already living paycheck to paycheck, how much longer can they keep up? I mean, eventually the poorest cannot take another 1% or 2%. And that's not even the real number.
The public is being taxed to death through inflation. In fact, if you look at a lot of the jobs that have been created recently, these are second jobs. These are third jobs. These are people that already have jobs. They don't want more jobs, but they need them because their paychecks have been so diminished by inflation. The only way that they can afford to eat is if they get another paycheck. So they're moonlighting. They're taking on, a hustle, side hustle, right? I mean, This is what's going on. This is the American economy.
I'm getting ready to go take my job back because of how bad inflation's got. I'm making more than I've ever made in my life, and I spend less than I've ever spent. And I can barely afford to get by because inflation is so crazy. I've never seen anything like it.
Look, and you've got the government pointing fingers like, oh, this inflation is terrible. The government is causing it. The government is spending all the money into circulation. The government is running these massive deficits. We ran enormous deficits in the immediate aftermath of COVID.
Yeah.
And now the politicians want to talk about, oh, COVID created these supply shortages. No, COVID didn't create anything. The government created those shortages. The government ordered companies to close down. The government ordered people to stay home. That was the government. COVID didn't do that. The government did that. And COVID didn't print all that money. It was the government, the Federal Reserve, central banks printed all that money. And the government was dumb enough to supply all these extra unemployment benefits, the Paycheck Protection Plan, these forgivable loans. The government did all the wrong things. The government's COVID cure was a much bigger problem for the economy than the disease of COVID. And I'm speaking about that, just recovering from COVID myself.
Yep, I got it a couple weeks ago. And so
all the good those vaccines did, I got it anyway.
Me too. How do we get out of this? At what point does the government have to say, what, we're just going to live with inflation? Is that where we're headed? Like 20% inflation
Well, I
is going to
think
be the
that's
norm?
where the Fed is headed. The Fed is going to make a trade-off. I mean, because in order to get rid of inflation, we're going to have not just a recession, but a depression. We're going to have a financial crisis. There's going to be a lot of losses, and there's going to be no bailouts. And in fact, the U.S. government is going to be forced to slash spending on Social Security, Medicare. The government may even have to default on the national debt. But since all these things are politically non-viable, I think the Federal Reserve is going to make the choice that inflation is the lesser evil, and that as much as it doesn't like inflation, it likes the alternative even less. And so inflation is just going to be a way of life. It's going to be high, and Americans are just going to have to deal with it. And that's what the markets still don't get. When they do, the dollar is going to crash, gold's going to go through the roof. And ultimately, I think the government's going to make the wrong choice. I think living with high inflation is going to be worse than facing the problem sooner and dealing with the economic fallout through default and crashes and bankruptcies and default, all that. That would be better than wiping everybody out, because the risk with inflation is if you really let it get going, the risk is hyperinflation. The risk is that you completely destroy the value of money. It's worthless. And that is the worst thing that could possibly happen, right? The money has no value anymore. And no matter how much money you have, you're still broke because nobody wants it.
At that point, would the best play would be to what? Just to try to work right now? Like if you were to give advice for somebody in the middle class right now that's living paycheck to paycheck, what would be the best thing that they could do to put themselves in a better position 2 years from now?
Well, I've been saying for years that if you're, working, you should go out and buy all the things you're going to need in the next several years. And, as long as they're non-perishable, just buy them now, because the prices are just going to go up. So you might as well buy it now. Don't put your money in the bank. Don't save, because your savings are just going to erode away in value as the price of everything you need to buy goes up. But obviously, if you run out of storage space, there's only so much stuff you can put in your closets. I don't know how much room you've got for, toiletries or, food that doesn't perish, or if you have a big freezer and you can, put meats in there and stuff. But then you could save some silver. You could hold on to that. Buy silver, because you can always use your silver to buy food in the future, or buy, medicine or toiletries or, whatever commodities that you need that you don't have room to store, because it's not that hard to store silver. Of course, it's even easier to store gold than it is to store silver, because you get an even greater quantity in a smaller space.
At what point does the government have to stop spending? So to keep inflation, say, at 10% right now, like the big wave of them printing during COVID happened. They're kind of doing their quantitative easing. It's kind of crashing the market. So if the government were to stop recklessly spending, would inflation cap around 10, 12, 15%? And we can kind of work with that? Or?
Yeah, well, obviously, if the government stopped all this reckless spending, that would help. But not only are they not going to stop, they're going to recklessly spend even more. That is the problem. And the economy is now in recession. I mean, the most comical part of the Fed press conference yesterday, we spoke about at the beginning, was when Jerome Powell basically adopted the Democrats' talking points and refused to accept that we're in recession. He said that even if we have 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, which has always been the definition of recession, he's saying that doesn't mean we're in recession. He says he doesn't think we have a recession, and he's basically got the memo from the Biden administration, and he's reading it, just like Janet Yellen, just like everybody else, which shows you how political the Fed is, because Biden is not acting like an independent Fed chairman. He's acting like a highly political member of the Biden administration, who is towing the political line that the economy is good, because Biden has to pretend the economy is good. He can't admit it's in recession, because then, well, he's the president. He doesn't want to accept responsibility for the recession. So what are they doing? Well, they're pretending there is no recession by redefining it.
And they redefine.
So George Orwell would be proud, or maybe not proud, but just not surprised.
No, not at all.
Vindicated.
No different than how they calculate CPI, right? CPI gets too high. They don't like it.
The government changes everything. They lie about everything to try to, pretend that things are not as bad as they really are. But the fact that they've got the Fed to do the lying too should be a big wake-up call for a lot of people.
Let's end it on this, Peter, because I know I only got you for a half hour and you're a busy man. So give us some optimism. Give us what would be the best thing that we could be looking into? What type of assets are you looking into? Some motivational advice to give the middle class a little bit of hope here.
Yeah, I don't have any optimism, unfortunately, for the economy in the near term and for America. I mean, I think we're in a lot of trouble. But there is optimism when it comes to opportunity. I mean, whenever there's a crisis, whenever people lose a lot of money, there's going to be a small number of people who make a lot of money. And I think I'm going to be included in that small group of people. But I think if you understand what's happening, and then more importantly, you understand what is going to happen, you can position yourself to profit from these events as they transpire. And all the things that have been happening in recent years, these are things that I have been predicting for many, many years. So I'm not surprised by what's happening. If anything, I'm just surprised that it took so long to happen.
Yep.
Whereas other people are still in denial and don't understand it. It all makes sense to me because I've been anticipating it, just like I was anticipating the 2008 financial crisis. I just thought the next crisis would happen a lot sooner than it is, but it's going to happen even worse because of the extra delay, because all the problems got so much worse during all of those years of can kicking. But people who understand what's going to happen, they will make a lot of money in the proper portfolios. And that is what I am trying to do for my clients at Euro Pacific Asset Management, trying to position people for the outcomes that the majority of people don't expect. I mean, why were we able to make so much money shorting subprime? Because so many other people were long. Very few people understood the problems in the housing and mortgage market prior to 2007. I understood it perfectly, which is why I was advising people to short these securities, because I knew that they were worthless. But most people didn't realize that. Well, the same thing is happening again. You have a situation where most people have no idea what's about to happen. And so assets are grossly mispriced. Some are way overpriced and others are way underpriced. And we're positioning our clients in the underpriced assets that are going to be repriced by the markets once investors figure out, what I already know. And that's how you make a lot of money, by getting in the right position before the crowd. And then you're positioned to cash in when the crowd finally figures out what you've known for a long time. So, if you're interested in profiting, I can help you. I mean, you could work with me not only directly at Euro Pacific Asset Management, where I can manage your portfolio, but if you don't have a lot of money, I manage a family of mutual funds, Euro Pacific mutual funds. My funds are up at every discount broker. I think the minimum investment maybe is $2,500 to get into my value fund, my dividend payers fund. I have a gold fund, emerging market fund, a foreign bond fund. So you can buy into my fund and I will manage that for you, manage those portfolios. You can get a prospectus, make sure you understand all the risks involved. But I think that the upside potential far outweighs the downside risk in these markets right now. And at least the markets that I'm investing in.
So do you think that the housing market bubble is getting ready to pop? Or how do you know when to get back into the market? That's the question.
Housing is a different story. I mean, because it's being driven too by inflation and rising construction costs. The big problem for housing is a lot of people, buy houses with mortgages, and mortgages are getting more and more expensive. And so that's very problematic for a lot of people who don't have the cash to buy a house. So, depending on where you live, I mean, I could see some substantial declines in home prices in some areas, but I think they might continue to go up in other areas. But ultimately, the dollar is going to crash. And so the price of everything is going to go up, but the value of everything will be going down. So even though your house is worth more in dollars, it will be worth less in terms of real things, certainly in terms of gold. I mean, if you start pricing things in gold, you'll be able to see substantial declines across the board in various assets.
So what would you be looking for signals from the Fed to that we might have found a bottom for like the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, the Dow?
Well, I don't know if it's the Fed that's going to signal the bottom in the market, but I think it will signal the bottom in gold, or that it's already passed, and the top in the dollar. I think the big aha moment is going to be when the Fed is forced to turn its attention from inflation to economic growth and jobs, when the Fed has to go back to additional stimulus at a time where inflation is still well above its official 2% target.
Yep.
And I think then it's over with, right? Then the jig is up for the Fed. They can no longer pretend that these policies are viable, because the excuse for QE in the past and 0% interest rates was always, well, we don't have any inflation. Inflation is below 2%, so we have the leeway to do this. Well, if inflation is 6% or 7%, and then they pour gasoline on that fire, what's the excuse? There is none. And then the market will realize that the dollar is a bottomless pit, that inflation is going to perpetuate forever, and we're never going back to 2%. And that's going to be a game changer for the bond market, for the foreign exchange markets, for the precious metals market. So those are the more significant markets, really, than the equity market.
And with all the countries collapsing around the world, the idea is that we want them to collapse and adopt the dollar. How does that work as these countries hit hyperinflation?
Well, they're not. I mean, everybody already uses the dollar. They're going to be divesting of the dollar. The dollar is going to lose its status as the dominant reserve currency. And that's another major problem for the U.S., because the U.S. depends on that status, because that's how we finance our enormous trade deficits and current account deficits, is because we can export the money we print and import the goods that everybody else produces. Well, when the people producing goods don't want the money we print, we're in a lot of trouble, because how are we going to replace those goods? I mean, all we can do is print money. That's a lot easier than producing stuff. You need factories. You need a supply chain. You need trained workers. You need raw materials. So it's a big difference between having to make stuff and just creating money out of thin air. And so that's going to mean a huge collapse in the American standard of living. That's what's coming.
And we saw China do it. We just saw India do it with dairy, and now we saw Russia do it with oil, right? Those are three big blows
all
to the
these
US
countries
dollar.
are ultimately, that you just mentioned, are going to be moving away from dollars.
Yep.
And, China in particular, America imports a lot of goods from China. We rely on China pretty heavily, and it's going to be a major adjustment when we can no longer afford to import Chinese products.
Now, if the Chinese currency collapsed, or Russia's currency collapsed?
I think it's the U.S. currency that's going to collapse, not the Chinese currency.
I understand that.
Chinese currency may lose value, like every currency, because the Chinese government has printed too much, just like everybody else. But I think the dollar is going to lose a lot more value, relative to the Chinese yuan.
But what if another G7 country, what if their currencies collapsed? Would that be detrimental to the U.S. economy, or would that be a plus for the US economy?
In the short run, if you had a collapse, let's say in the euro or the yen, that would probably help the dollar for a while, and so that would help the US. But I think that would just be temporary, because I believe that we have a greater problem. I mean, they have big problems in Europe and Japan. I'm not trying to say they don't. I just think we have even more severe problems here. The markets just don't understand that yet.
Jeez, Peter. Well, man, it was such an honor to have you on the show, man. I'm probably one of your biggest fans, man, and I can't tell you how excited I am, man. I'm like nervous over here to have you on the show, man. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Have a great day, buddy. I appreciate you.